Space is truly fascinating. Not that giant void hanging overhead, though it has its own merits. I mean, the space around us, the space in which we exist. And likewise, the space that makes up game worlds is an incredibly interesting topic. What's the lore of this brand new world? Does the space even make physical sense? It doesn't have to, as the game creates and destroys the world in relation to the player. But it can be a nice touch when it does. When thinking about video game spaces, video game worlds, Dark Souls is always what comes to my mind as being an interesting and well-implemented world. And with the Demon's Souls remake recently released, I have an opportunity to talk about this excellent decade-old game and have it be kind of topical. Playing through Demon's Souls for my first time, however, I've realized that the world design, its physical layout and lauded interconnectedness, is a bit of an anomaly in the Souls series, and indeed in all FromSoft games since Demon's Souls. So today, let's dive into the worlds of FromSoft. Hello world, my name is Atticus and welcome to the experiment. Before we can compare and contrast, we should first examine each world on its own, and I can think of no better order than chronological. This is the progression available in Demon's Souls. A new character begins in Tutorial Land, and then, after learning the basic mechanics, they progress to the Nexus. From there, a new character does have to complete Stage 1-1, the first area in Boletaria Castle, before the other paths open up. After the Demon of 1-1 is defeated, however, the player is free to advance upon any route. I could make an attempt to place these regions on a world map of some sort based on what we see from the areas and cutscenes. However, the game itself treats these areas as disparate worlds, connected only by existing within the same arbitrary and undefined borders. Each region is distinct, and I imagine that is to give the impression of a vast land. Each individual world is also fairly linear. While stages themselves may twist and turn upon themselves, each stage leads directly into the next one. So here, in the first of the Souls-like games, we see a world design centered around player choice, with only a few caveats in that 1-1 has to be completed first and 1-3 cannot be accessed until at least one archdemon, the boss at the end of a world, has been defeated. Other than that, if you want to beeline the Valley of Defilement to get the Regenerator Ring, you are free to do that, or save it for last. You can beat every world except for Shrine of Storms because you don't want to deal with the flying rays. This world setup reminds me of Dark Souls 2, in all honesty, but we'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to make a bold claim with absolutely no foundation other than gut feeling. The intricate and frankly amazing world design of Dark Souls was an accident. That's not to say there was no work gone into balancing and fine-tuning that design, but I don't believe the FromSoft team went into Dark Souls with a plan of having an interconnected world. The game has two major sections which can be divided quite cleanly by the boss fight at the end of Anor Londo. After a hard-fought victory, the player is given a key item that grants the ability to warp between bonfires. After this point, the world opens up, with 3 previously inaccessible locations becoming available for exploration. These 3 areas, and the 4th one, which was accessible but is now mandatory, don't have any interplay, each being distinct and separate from the others, with a weird exception where one is able to be seen from another but not the other way around. The first segment of the game, in rather stark contrast, has an all roads lead to Firelink mentality, which can introduce some incredible moments when, after wandering lost and afraid for too long, the map transition effects play and you are greeted with the familiar name, Firelink Shrine, and a wave of relief washes over you. Progression in this game is not as clean as the others, almost entirely on account of the interconnectivity, but here's a progression chart nonetheless. The caveats are a bit more numerous than that of Demon Souls, but I'll do my best to cover all of them. First, by starting as a thief or by taking the Master Key starting gift, a player can choose to start with either the Undead Parish Bell or the Blighttown Bell. I can't imagine voluntarily going to Blighttown, but it can also be used to skip the depths entirely, as well as most of Blighttown, which I can't get behind. The Four Kings can be one of the first bosses you beat, again with the Master Key, by using the door in New Londo to the Valley of Drakes and sprinting through there to get to Darkroot Basin. From there you can either farm an absurd number of souls to buy the key to Darkroot Garden and run to Sif's boss battle from there, or skirt the Hydra and take the scenic route. Even without the Master Key, from Firelink Shrine, the Undead Burg, Catacombs, and New Londo are all immediately accessible. Two of those contain enemies which a new player would be hard-pressed to defeat, permanently at least, which guide a new player to the Undead Burg first. The bold player may run through the Catacombs and defeat Pinwheel, allowing them to increase Estus uses early on, but progression is almost immediately blocked afterwards. New Londo can also be done early, though the Four Kings cannot be defeated until Sif is. Completing everything but the boss, though, opens up the Valley of Drakes and consequently Darkroot Garden, allowing a player to defeat the Four Kings as their third boss, without having to take the Master Key or start as a thief. This has all been off the cuff, so I may have missed a few shortcuts. I'm pretty sure there are some weird jumps that can be done to get to Lower Undead Burg from the Undead Burg, but I'm not positive that's intended. But Sen's Fortress can't be accessed until both bells are rung, which requires fighting the Bell Gargoyles and Quelaag. If you want to fight just those two, I recommend the Master Key, going through New Londo to the Valley of Drakes to beat Quelaag, then back up to the Valley of Drakes into Darkroot Basin, circling back up to the Garden to meet up with Andre, from that bonfire fighting the Bell Gargoyles. Sen's Funhouse opens up, and that has to be cleared to get to Anor Londo, which has to be cleared before the Tomb of Giants, Demon Ruins, and the Duke's Archives open up. From this point, with the added warp mechanic, things look a lot like Demon Souls, with 4 distinct areas to clear. The individual stages aren't as clear, but we are more focused on the world at large in this video. In terms of the physical game space the world of Lordran takes up, it seems to make pretty good sense with the exception of the Tomb of Giants. Illusory Wall goes in greater detail in his Dark Souls Dissected series, so I'll just go over the highlights. In several areas of Dark Souls, the player can see different places that they'll be journeying to, and with some clever use of death and teleportation, we can see that the vistas and the actual locations usually align fairly well, usually being off only a bit and typically with good reason. Again, the exception is the Tomb of Giants. I believe the time spent underground and the use of verticality going up and down are used to disorient the player, giving the impression of having delved far deeper than has actually happened. With something like Dark Souls Map Viewer, however, we can see that the Tomb of Giants clips through Quelaag's domain and New Londo, and that one vista from the Tomb of Giants into Ash Lake should actually be into New Londo. Speaking of vistas, from the Tomb of Giants at certain points you can see the Demon Ruins, Valley of Drakes, and the Ash Lake Expanse, but the Tomb of Giants is not visible from any of those locations. I'll concede Ash Lake is a bit of an exception, since what you see from the Tomb of Giants is not the beach of Ash Lake you traverse elsewhere in the game, but the other two share no such excuse. I agree with Illusory Wall's conclusion that we are meant to feel like we've gone further down than we actually have, and that the Tomb of Giants is supposed to be beneath the world and the bows of Ash Lake. I don't believe I've yet mentioned the Painted World, the Undead Asylum, or the DLC areas, and that's because in lore and in game they exist separate from the world at hand. Each requires some teleport to get to or from. In lore, the Undead Asylum is only noted as being north. The Painted World is a separate reality, a world inside of a painting. and the DLC exists in the past. A neat thing with that, though, is that the space does line up with the Darkroot Garden area down to where the trees are placed. The DLC ones are just shorter. All in all, a well put together world that at first encourages player creativity and then limits that to which region do you feel like tackling right now. I personally really like Dark Souls 2. It's not without its flaws, to be sure, but it has an engaging and awe-inspiring world. It's difficult being a sequel, but I think leaving Lordran behind was a good move. Early on, it does lean a bit heavily on the prepare to die mantra and takes an admittedly brutal approach in beating the lessons of the first Dark Souls out of new players, but a grand experience nonetheless. As far as the world design goes, it may make some interesting choices, but I think they work in the story presented. From the get-go, we follow the Demon Souls philosophy to world choice. The player is dropped in a similar central area to Firelink Shrine, but instead of all roads leading back to Majula, all roads start from there. The player can choose to go to the Shaded Woods, Forest of Fallen Giants, the Gutter, or Hyde's Tower of Flame. Each route starts the player down a journey to collect a Great Soul, with only a kind of exception from Hyde's Lighthouse. That route actually leads to 2 Great Souls, the one at Sinner's Rise and the one in the Old Iron Keep, but the latter requires progressing through Hyde's route a little and then turning back and going to the Huntsman's Copse. From these 4 outposts, it's fairly linear with a few offshoots until 4 Great Souls are collected. Then, from the Shaded Woods, you can finally make your way to Drangleic Castle. This always feels like the end of the game to me, but there's a surprising amount more. It just gets a lot more linear. Much like the first Dark Souls, the second does some interesting things with player choice in the first half, but drops the intricacy in the second. And speaking of interesting things, I said you had to get 4 Great Souls to progress to Drangleic Castle, but that's not entirely accurate. First, it's a bit misleading, as it suggests getting 4 different Great Souls, but Dark Souls 2 has an item that can progress a region to the next new game level. So, after using this item, a bonfire ascetic, the area around whichever bonfire you used it in will update as if it were at the start of a new game plus. Enemies will be more difficult as well as drop more souls, bosses will respawn, and in some instances, new events will occur. Using this, one could defeat the Rotten, the boss at the end of the Gutter route, 4 times, and then go to Drangleic Castle without touching the rest of the game. Another method is collecting 1,000,000 souls over the course of your playthrough. This is soul memory, which means every soul could have been lost to death, but the path will still open, which I think is just neat. As we look at the actual physical layout, I gotta say it does better than I expected. There is of course the Old Iron Keep existing off in the ether, accessible only by Mifa's glass elevator. The Dragon Eyrie exists in a similar limbo, but it's not as bad, but with it being on mountaintops instead of in lava. Looking at the map viewer, we see all these on by default. I imagine those are the regions that aren't a teleport away and don't cut into other regions. Most of the issues seem to exist in the Shaded Woods, where Drangleic Castle, Aldia's Keep, and the Doors of Pharos all kind of exist simultaneously, with the Dragon Eyrie floating eerily above. Things Betwixt also gets in on the mix, but that's supposed to be a strange realm between Drangleic and wherever the player character began their journey, so I'm not sure how much that one should count. I mentioned that I thought all of this nonsense worked within the story presented. Allow me to defend that. Dark Souls 2 presents itself as a tale about cycles and a tale about loss. The opening scene warns that the main character will lose themselves, and indeed, before the events of the game, that seems to have already happened. The presence of the flame in Drangleic being the only thing that gives them a semblance of humanity. No one in Majula even remembers how they came to live there, or why. And if they do know, they soon forget. Countless kingdoms and civilizations have risen and fallen, and the flame has been rekindled for each age. Strayed is the only living character that even knows his homeland existed, and that's only because he was petrified for ages before the player character frees him for boss weapons and that bonfire. Time flows strangely in Lordran, and the land converges on Lothric. In Dark Souls 2, I imagine both are at play, if not quite as overtly. Dark Souls 2 shows us a world lost in its own endless cycles. The first game introduces us to the cycle and the third concludes it, but the second one is trapped within. Not only are the characters within Drangleic losing themselves, the very world is as well. I have a terrible secret, a shame that must now come to light. I've not beaten Bloodborne. I've also not beaten Demon Souls, but after missing it on PS3 and it only just recently releasing again, I think that's a bit more excusable. I've gotten decently far, but I don't know it as well as the others. Running through what I am familiar with, it strikes me as a fairly linear experience. As far as how it physically fits together, I honestly don't know. The Forbidden Woods feed into the clinic in central Yharnam, so I don't imagine there's much of an issue there. Likewise, Old Yharnam connects to the Hypogean Jail, which eventually wraps back around to the Grand Cathedral. Other than that, there are a few offshoots and the Nightmare Realms. The third Dark Souls eschews any idea of an interconnected world and is the first to really break with the spokes design of previous worlds. Technically, from the high wall of Lothric, you can fight the Dancer first and then go explore Lothric Castle and the Consumed Garden, but once you do, you still have to fight Vort and then make it over to the Abyss Watchers. There's not much to say beyond that. For physicality, anytime the player moves vertically, the game wants to think they've moved more than they have. The biggest offenders here are the Catacombs and Lothric Castle. The Profane Capital is also a lot more up than it would have you believe. I think there was a bit of a missed opportunity here to barrel down on the fantastic unrealism of Dark Souls 2. The land is converging, after all. Things don't have to make sense, but they pretty much do. And apart from a binary choice of which direction to go and a couple of optional offshoots, there's not a lot of player agency in how to engage with this world. Bit of a speedrun there. Is it painfully obvious that I played Dark Souls 1 and 2 the most out of all of these? Sekiro is actually the first FromSoft game that I managed to beat. It shares a bit of world design with Bloodborne in that both are incredibly focused on their atmosphere. The Souls games visit several locales, like swamps, in their large fantasy world, but Sekiro and Bloodborne dive deep into one part of a wider world. I believe, relying on 3-year-old memories, that the opening and closing acts are pretty linear in construction, but the central part, after reaching Ashina Castle, opens up quite a bit. The main thing I remember from my 3 playthroughs is that after the first run I made sure to get to Mibu Village before beating the Guardian Ape, because I did not enjoy my fight with him and his bride. The same freedom of movement that could be found in the first few Souls games is absent here, but I appreciate that a few critical paths simultaneously become available in the middle of the game. Again, I can't really examine the physical realities of this world, but it seems rather cohesive. I would be interested to see how close the shinobi shortcuts really are, and I imagine the fight against the 4 monkeys is placed in some strange location. Ultimately, it would appear that the first Dark Souls is indeed the only game with that level of interconnectivity, and Dark Souls 2 makes the least sense, but that was never really debated. The world design of the first Dark Souls was so well received that I have to wonder why FromSoft never seemed to try to recreate it. I imagine that creating a world in that way and then creating interesting levels within that world is just far more trouble than it's worth. If the developers don't know how I'm entering the Valley of Drakes, Blighttown, or any other major hub area, then how do they know where to face the enemies? Conversely, in all the more linear setups, that question is easily answered. It could also just be that they enjoy making branching paths more than connecting every region back. Warping is another interesting mechanic in this regard. Dark Souls 1 is the only game in which it is not immediately available, and even when it is, only to a select few bonfires. Whatever actually happened to cause the anomaly of Dark Souls 1, whether a pleasant accident or failed experiment, I'm glad it did. We may not see another intricately and interestingly designed world in the same flavor as Dark Souls 1 from FromSoft, but all the worlds we've experienced since have been awe-inspiring. I have been Atticus, and thank you for participating. Actually, before I forget, we have recently received this Elden Ring world map preview, so as long as we're on the topic of worlds from let's take a look